All right, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Wow, Pope Francis really he did it again. He really caused quite a storm here on social media. I woke up around, I don't know, 6:30 or so, opened up my messages and was being inundated with all kinds of comments about what Pope Francis just said in Singapore right before his flight returning to Rome. And so he's in trouble again. He's in hot water by making some pretty interesting comments that we're going to take a look at, and we're going to see if they make sense, not only theologically, but in light of some of the things that he himself has said. I mean, keep in mind, Pope Francis is the very one who has said elsewhere that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him, quoting John 14:6. He's the same Pope who says Jesus is the only way to heaven. There's no other way to heaven. He's the same one who says we must evangelize people. Everyone has the right to hear the gospel and receive the gospel. We hear that Pope Francis, and then we see something else that seems to place a different emphasis and to seems to be a different message. So we're going to take a look at it, see if we can make some sense of it. Before we can even get into the question of the theology behind what he's saying, I want to point out there's a great difficulty here because I've seen about three different English translations of what he has said so far. The challenging part in really getting at what Pope Francis has said here is there is a video of him making certain statements. We're going to watch that video here in just a second. I believe he's speaking in Italian, and he gives some comments about various religions and various ways to God. And it's being translated on the spot in English by a translator who's present, who's literally like right next to him. We're going to take a look at that translation, and then we're going to take a look at the English translation that's on the Vatican website. And then we're going to take a look at another English translation that is floating around on the internet. And we're going to notice actually there's some variance among all these that can significantly change the meaning between all of these. And so there's some confusion with what exactly did he say in English? I don't speak Italian, so which one of these do I need to go with? So trying to discern what exactly he has said here is in and of itself a challenge, and that's part of the problem that we're seeing. But be that as it may, even going with maybe some of the more problematic translations, we're going to take a look at the theology behind it and see if it makes sense with what he has said elsewhere, if it's Catholic, if it's heresy. We're going to take a look at all that. So we'll look at the various translations. We're going to look at what others are saying about Pope Francis and their reaction. We're going to take a look at the theological claims themselves. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at some difficulties that seem to remain once we take everything into account. So perhaps some challenges and difficulties that still remain. Before we dive in, however, I got to remind you, hit that subscribe button. I was shocked to see I haven't even gone live yet, and already a third of the people have downvoted this video. It's like I haven't even said anything yet, and people have already downvoted this. Why? And it's no sweat off my back because a downvote or an upvote, either way, is actually helpful for me. So it's like, okay, whatever. But it's odd that people would be so irrational as to downvote a video that hasn't even happened yet. I'm still trying to figure that one out. So, hey, y'all, go ahead and hit that like button if you haven't already to offset the trolls who are already downvoting the content, and hit that subscribe button. The majority of people who are watching this video and who watch this channel have not yet hit that subscribe button. They're not subscribers. So go ahead and do that for me. Okay, well, let's take a look at the first thing that I saw floating around on the internet. And this English translation of Pope Francis's comments is the one that is really just floating around everywhere. And I have to point out, This translation, which seems to be different than what the Pope actually said, and the English translation that's on the Vatican website, this third translation, the one that popped up first on our social media feed, was posted by all sorts of media outlets all at the same time. And I just thought to myself, that's interesting, because it's not the official English translation. It's not even a translation, a perfect translation of what Pope Francis actually says in the video, but they all are consistently posting the exact same translation here. Why is that? Well, what happens, what I've noticed is, it seems to me like the media, they just repeat what each other say, and they don't really look at the primary sources. So it's weird that all of a sudden everybody popped up with this one translation that doesn't even appear to be entirely accurate at some points, as we're going to see here in a moment. So it's kind of interesting the way that works. Okay, but this is the one that I saw at first. Pope Francis to children in Singapore. All religions are paths to reach God. They are, to make a comparison, like different languages, different dialects to get there. But God is God for everyone. If you start to fight saying, my religion is more important than yours, mine is true and yours isn't, where will this lead us? There is only one God, and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Some are Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christians. There are different ways to God. Now, having seen that, you can understand why Pope Francis is in trouble, right? it's pretty obvious, right? How does that work with Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? There's no name under heaven by which men must be saved, as Acts chapter 2 puts it. What happened to this notion that, Christianity is the one true faith, and outside the church there is no salvation? It seems like we're undermining that. What's going on here? So you can understand a lot of people are just confused, upset, angry. So let's see if we can make some sense out of this. And then again, we're going to have to consider what he says in light of what he said elsewhere, where we have seen him directly say, Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through him. He's the only way to salvation. There's no salvation in no one else. Everyone must be evangelized. It's like, wait, which Pope Francis is talking today? That one or this one? It's like, okay, so let's try to make some sense out of it. Let me go to the video itself. This is the video around the 38-minute mark. He begins to speak. 38-minute, 44 seconds. We're going to watch it, and we're going to watch the translation that takes place on the spot by the bishop right next to him. And we're going to see what it says. I actually sat down and wrote it down. So we'll take a look at it here visually, but let me just first play the video for you. And also let me make sure that y'all can hear the audio before I begin to play it. Okay, here we go.
Una delle cose che più mi ha colpito di voi giovani, di questi qui, no? È la capacità del dialogo interreligioso.
One of the things that struck me about all of you here is your ability to engage in interreligious dialogue.
E questo è molto importante.
And this is very important.
Perché se voi incominciate a litigare, la mia religione è più importante della tua, la mia è la vera, la tua non è vera, dove ci porta questo?
Because if we start to fight amongst ourselves and saying, my religion is more important than yours, my religion is true, yours is not, where will that lead us?
Dove?
Where will it lead us?
Qualcuno risponda, dove?
Someone respond. Where would it lead us? La distruzione.
È cosa così. E ci vuole litigare.
Yes, it's okay to discuss and to...
Tutte le religioni sono un cammino per arrivare a Dio.
Because every religion is a way to arrive at God.
Dirò una comparazione, sono come diverse lingue, diversi idiomi per arrivare lì.
Sort of a comparison, an example would be they're sort of like different languages in order to arrive at God.
Ma Dio è Dio per tutti.
But God is God for all.
E come Dio è Dio per tutti, noi siamo tutti figli di Dio.
And if God is God for all, then we're all sons and daughters of God.
Ma il mio Dio è più importante del tuo.
But my God is more important than your God.
È vero quello?
Is that true?
C'è un solo Dio lì. E noi sono idiomi, cammino, lingue per arrivare a Dio.
There's only one God, and each of us is a language, so to speak, in order to arrive at God.
Qualcuno è Sikh, qualcuno è musulmano, qualcuno
Sikh, Muslim,
Hindi, qualcuno cristiano,
Hindu,
ma sono
Christian.
diversi cammini.
There are different paths.
Understood?
Okay, so that's the part you get to clearly see the words coming out of his mouth. Now, I am not in a position to determine whether or not that English translator there is authentically and reliably translating Pope Francis into English on the spot. I don't know Italian. So those of y'all who speak Italian, y'all can determine that. I see somebody in the chat who's saying, I speak Italian, the live translator is perfect. Oh, okay. And others might say, no, I think that he's missing it. You know, I can't help you there. All I can do is look at the different English translations. I can kind of get the sense of what he's saying, you know, from the midst of pretty much all of them, and then we can examine them theologically. But let's take a look at the different English translations that are out there, because, you know, there are some differences that could change the meaning in between them. Some are saying, hey, it's pretty close, pretty much good. So, you know, most of the people, another person, I speak Italian translator is perfect. So about 4 people in the chat have confirmed, hey, that translator is effectively getting it. Okay, well, that's curious, because what you're going to see from the Vatican English website is a little different than what you just saw here. And then what you see floating around online is different than both of these. So we got some confusion going on with just what exactly is being said here. Maybe we need to go back to everything is said in Latin, right? Then we won't have this problem. Then we'll have other problems, such as people not understanding anything that's said. Okay. Let's try and make some sense out of this. I'm going to share my screen. Let's take a look at a few translations. I just showed you the video, right? What he said. Then I showed you the one that's floating around everywhere. There's that one. And here's now a, you know, direct copy of what was just translated. So what you just heard translated by that bishop, let me just read it to you again. One of the things that struck me about all of you here is your ability to engage in interreligious dialogue. And this is very important, because if we start to fight among ourselves and saying, my religion is more important than yours, and religion is true and yours is not, where will that lead us? And the people are basically saying disaster, right? They're saying all unanimously will lead to disaster. Where will it lead us? Someone respond here, where would it lead us? Yes, it's okay to discuss because every religion is a way to arrive at God. Sort of a comparison, an example would be there are sort of like different languages in order to arrive at God, but God is God for all. And if God is God for all, then we're all sons and daughters of God. But my God is more important than your God. Is that true? There's only one God in each of us. And look at this, in each of us, and each of us is a language, so to speak, in order to arrive at God. There are different paths. Now, notice that phrase here, each one of us is a language, so to speak. You can already tell what's being said there is relatively different than what is being said in the one that's floating around online. where it says each of us has a language to arrive at God. Well, that's different than saying each of us is a language to arrive at God. And that is different than the one that's on the Vatican website, a third variant. Here's what is on the Vatican website as the English translation. One of the things that has impressed me about the young people here is your capacity for interfaith dialogue. This is very important because if you start arguing, my religion is more important than yours, or mine is true one and yours is not true, where does this lead? Somebody answer. And a young person says destruction. And he says, that is correct. Religions are seen as paths trying to reach God. I will use an analogy. They are like different languages that express the divine. But God is for everyone, and therefore we are all God's children. Now notice that. They are like different languages that express the divine. And then he says, but my God is more important than yours. Is this true? There's only one God. And religions are like languages that try to express ways to approach God. Now, that's a little different than everything else we saw. Religions are like languages that try to express ways to God. Wait, hold on. That's not what is being said over here, right? Over here it says there's only one God and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Not they try to arrive at God. So which one is it? I mean, so we're seeing a lot of variations here. And some are saying, well, hey, see, this is evidence that the Vatican is trying to clean up what he actually said. You know, well, what he actually said is that transcript I just showed you moments ago that is a little different than what the Vatican is saying. Whether they're trying to clean it up or not, I don't know, but it does look a little different than what he actually said. So something's going on there. But it says, is this true? There's only one God, and religions are like languages that try to express ways to approach God. Some Sikh, some Muslim, some Hindu, some Christian. Understood. Yet interfaith dialogue among young people takes courage and so on. So little hard to determine, okay, what did he actually say? Because I don't speak Italian, but most people are saying, you know, this English translator that we saw that translated on the spot effectively gives us the meaning. So that's kind of what I'm going to have to go with to operate here and evaluate it theologically. But it is curious that we're seeing so many different versions of what he's saying out there. And I do see somebody in the chat asking the question, is it magisterial? Well, no, it's not magisterial. But there might still be some difficulties with this. So we still need to evaluate it. And we're certainly going to do that. Okay, but let me first remind you before we move forward, hit that subscribe button and the like button. The trolls are out. Already they're attacking. You know how they do. They're already attacking the video, already lying. So, hey, go ahead, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button to help offset the trolls that are there in the chat and elsewhere. Okay, so I want to take a look at what others are saying about Pope Francis before we take a look at other things that he has said to try to make sense of his statement. Let me share my screen again and show you what a few commentators are saying so far and how they're interpreting Pope Francis. Okay, well, we see Bishop Strickland has released a few statements, so let's see what he has to say. He says, please pray for Pope Francis to clearly state that Jesus Christ is the only way. Well, amen. Interestingly enough, he has done that. I'll show that in a moment. Maybe he needs to do it again, but he has done that. It is curious, however, that to this day, Bishop Strickland appears to be unaware that Pope Francis has explicitly said Jesus is the only way to salvation. At some point, it would be helpful if he would grapple with that. I don't know when that will be. To deny this is to deny him. And I agree. I agree with that. Interestingly enough, though, Pope Francis doesn't deny that. He affirms it. If we deny Christ, he will deny us. He cannot deny himself. Agreed. Breaking. Pope Francis, every religion is a way to arrive at God. And he shares LifeSite News. Okay. So it's curious. Pope Francis is being perceived as by Bishop Strickland as denying this truth, even though elsewhere he has explicitly asserted this truth. It would be helpful if Strickland attempts to try to make sense out of the fact that he does say those things, and yet he also said what he just said now. Does he have a theory on how these two things cohere? Is Pope Francis just contradicting himself? That's one option. Is Pope Francis just lying? So he says one thing to one group of people, says something else to another group of people. That's one theory. A third theory is that actually his statements can be reconciled. But either, whichever way this thing shakes down, it would be helpful if maybe Strickland and some of his critics would try to grapple with some of the complexities here. Instead of just presenting one side of what he said, maybe also present the other side and then try to offer some kind of theory here on how he can say both. I would like to hear what they have to say. Do they think he's just contradicting himself or lying, or are they not even aware that he has said some of this stuff elsewhere? That might be the case. Well, he posts after this, Dominus Iesus. This is a document by the Vatican. This is what the Catholic Church teaches regarding the unicity of Jesus Christ. Great document. I'm pretty sure I did a whole show reviewing it. The only way to God the Father is through his Son, Jesus Christ. To deny this is to deny the Catholic faith. That is called heresy. So he's implying Pope Francis is teaching heresy. Not the first time, because we have seen explicitly Bishop Strickland say Pope Francis teaches heresy, namely in Desiderio Desideravi. So wouldn't be the first time that he has implied this. Elsewhere, he's made it more explicit. But that's kind of the route that he's taking. Pope Francis is just denying the faith. This is heresy. He goes on to say elsewhere, to claim that every religion is good enough is to claim that the life, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is not the redemption of the world, thus to deny the Catholic faith and to deny Christ. So his position is, Pope Francis, he's just denying that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. He's denying this biblical principle. He's denying this dogma. It's heresy. He's denying Christ. That seems to be the direction he's going. Again, not giving you the full picture and not really accounting for everything that Francis has said. Try to make some sense out of it. Okay, well, we see along with Bishop Strickland, the Protestants are saying the exact same thing. Interestingly enough, Strickland and the Protestants seem to be on the same page. And here's Ali Beth Shucky Stucky. Throwback to, I think that was a Saturday Night Live skit. It was one of the two, but throwback for y'all. Ali Beth Stucky, who says, this is not the gospel. The gospel is centered on the reality that Jesus, God made flesh, is the only way, truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through him, John 14:6, which, okay, Pope Francis explicitly says that. Were you aware of that, Ali Beth? Might want to interact with that. If anyone believes what the Pope is saying here, including the Pope himself, they are not a Christian. So she just excommunicated Pope Francis from the Catholic faith. He's no longer a Christian. He's been excommunicated from the flock by Protestant. Okay, well, so those are some of the reactions that we're seeing, and I want to say they're a little shallow because, again, they don't take into account everything that Pope Francis has said and try to offer some kind of comprehensive thought here. They just take one thing, ignore the rest. Okay. And by the way, notice they're all quoting from that translation by Catholic Sat that we've seen isn't exactly what he was saying in the video. Take note that they're all doing that. They all end up sharing that one original translation that came out first thing in the morning that everyone in the media seems to be presenting, and I don't know where they got it from. Okay, so let's actually take a look at a little bit more of a comprehensive view of what Pope Francis has said. This is from one of his homilies where he explicitly affirms Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and salvation is in him and him alone. Drawing especially on the reading from the gospel according to St. John, Pope Francis recalled the Lord's words, at once a warning and a promise, echoing the readings of Good Shepherd Sunday the day before. He who does not enter the sheepfold by the door but tries another way is a thief and a robber, he said. Christ is the door, stressed Pope Francis, and there is no other. That's a direct quote from Pope Francis. So he explicitly says there's no other way. The Lord thus clearly says you cannot enter eternal life by any entryway. That is not the door. That is not Jesus. I mean, you can't get any more explicit than that. He is the door, our life, and not only of eternal life, but also of our daily lives. Any decision I take either in the name of Jesus, passing by way of the door of Jesus, or I take it a little. Shall we say in simple language, through the smuggler's hatch. We enter the enclosure through the door, which is Jesus. So he affirms John 14:6, the unicity of Christ, salvation in him alone. We've seen this multiple times from him. We've also seen him emphasize the fact that everyone needs to be evangelized. The gospel needs to be given to everyone. Everyone has a right to hear the gospel. Here's him from Evangelium Gaudium or Evangelii Gaudium. Lastly, we cannot forget that evangelization is first and foremost about preaching the gospel to those who do not know Jesus Christ or who have always rejected him. Many of them are quietly seeking God, led by a yearning to see his face, even in countries of ancient Christian tradition. All of them have a right to receive the gospel. Christians have a duty to proclaim the gospel without excluding anyone. And then he quotes from John Paul II. He says, John Paul II asks us to recognize that there must be no lessening of the impetus to preach the gospel to those who are far from Christ, because this is the first task of the church. Indeed, today, missionary activity still represents the greatest challenge for the church, and the missionary task must remain foremost. So he's saying Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, and we can't let up on proclaiming the gospel. That has to be front and center for us Catholics. Now, is there a contradiction here? Because we're hearing on the one hand this side of Pope Francis, on the other we hear something a little different, as we saw in that video. What's going on? Well, I just want to say, first of all, to the critics like your Stricklands of the world and your Ali Beth Stuckies of the world, I want to ask, wait, if you have a criticism of Pope Francis, that's fine. Join the club. I do too. That's fine. But how about you present a more comprehensive perspective of Pope Francis and then ask some questions? How about you at least make people aware that he says Jesus is the way, the truth, and life? Don't just pretend that he doesn't do that. How about you present that to people and then maybe ask some probing questions? Or if you're Strickland and you're a Catholic, my question is, why isn't Strickland trying to explain how the Pope that he is in communion with says this on the one hand and that on the other? I mean, care to explain that? You're in communion with this guy, Bishop Strickland. You got any theories here? Or is he just contradicting himself? Or is he just lying? Is he a Peronist who says one thing to one group of people, something else to another group of people? Offer some kind of theory, but don't just pretend that there isn't these two versions of Pope Francis that are out there. There are certainly these two versions of Pope Francis out there, and we have to grapple with that. So that's kind of what I want to do. We're going to take a look at a number of documents from the Magisterium. We're going to try to make some sense out of what he has said. And then I'm going to offer some criticisms of what Pope Francis has said, even after we have looked at the Magisterium and what it teaches on this subject. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can start to take a look at some magisterial sources on this. Again, let me remind you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. If you're just now tuning in, there's a lot of trolls who are already downvoting this video before it even started. There's people in the chat lying right now saying, oh, you're just making things up here. You're just Pope-splaining, cope, blah, blah, blah. Go ahead and help me combat that nonsense and all the trolls that are out there by hitting the like button and the subscribe button. Okay, so this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. A lot of people are pointing this out. Well-known point, but for those who may not be familiar, this is CCC 843, and it says this. The Catholic Church recognizes in other religions that search among shadows and images for the God who is unknown, yet near, since he gives life and breath in all things and wants all men to be saved. Thus, the church considers all goodness and truth found in these religions as a preparation for the gospel and given by him who enlightens all men that they may have length or may at length have life. And so this is the notion you'll often hear people talk about, Bishop Barron and others. They'll highlight that in these false religions, you can still find some truth to them to one degree or another, some more than others, granted. But you can see in some of them more truth than in others. You could see more goodness in some of them than others, more beauty in some of them than in others. But all truth, goodness, and beauty is God's truth, goodness, and beauty. So we can see some traces of the divine even in false religions. We see that in the New Testament, as we're going to examine here in a moment. But that is what effectively the Catechism is getting at. It's not saying everything in these false religions are true, good, and beautiful. And everything in them is a preparation for the gospel. No, but it is saying that there are some things in them that prepare them for the gospel. There are some things in them that are guidance and light. Again, to one degree or another, depending on what religion we're talking about. Even in some of the non-religious views out there, you can see Justin Martyr talking about the philosophers and how the philosophers had the seeds of the Logos or of Christ in them. Insofar as they said something that was true, there's a seed of Christ in what they're saying. I'm going to offer a criticism of that here in a moment, though, so hang tight on that. Well, let's get more of a comprehensive overview first. Let's take a look at Nostra Aetate, paragraph 2. This is a document from the Second Vatican Council that gives a little bit more information on this particular point. It says, from ancient times down to the present, there is found among various peoples a certain perception of that hidden power which hovers over the course of things and over the events of human history. At times, some indeed have come to the recognition of a supreme being or even of a father. This perception and recognition penetrates their lives with a profound religious sense. Religions, however, are bound up with an advanced culture, have struggled to answer the same questions by means of more refined concepts and of a more developed language. Thus, in Hinduism, men contemplate the divine mystery and express it through an inexhaustible abundance of myths and through searching philosophical inquiry. They seek freedom from the anguish of our human condition, either through ascetical practices or profound meditation or flight to God with love and trust. And by the way, it notes they seek these things. Do they attain it? That's a different question. Again, Buddhism in its various forms realizes the radical insufficiency of this changeable world. It teaches a way by which men in a devout and confident spirit may be able either to acquire the state of perfect liberation or attain by their own efforts or through a higher help, supreme illumination. Well, it teaches that. Do they attain it? That's a different question. It's not making comments on that. It's just saying, well, here's what they teach. Here's what they say. Likewise, other religions found everywhere try to counter the restlessness of the human heart, each in its own manner, by proposing ways, comprising teachings, rules of life, and sacred rites. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. So those things that are true and holy in these religions, the Church accepts. Now, there's also some false and ugly and horrible and evil things in some of these religions. Obviously, the Church doesn't accept those things. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth. So notice that it is saying there are some differences here. Nevertheless, there is a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. And again, this is to various degrees, depending on what religion we're talking about. Indeed, she proclaims and ever must proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6, in whom men find the fullness of religious life, in whom God has reconciled all things to himself. So Vatican II has taken this balanced approach. It's saying, yes, there's some good things found in these religions, and they're true. And whenever they are true, that's a ray of light, because all truth is God's truth. But they also have some things that are not true and that conflict with the truth. But it says, look, ultimately, we got to call people to Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and the fullness of religious life, which is found in the Christian faith. And in fact, it's explicit in Dignitatis Humanae. It's in the Catholic faith explicitly. It explicitly notes there's salvation only in the Catholic Church, which it identifies as the one true faith. That's what Vatican II says. Catholicism, one true faith. So keep that in mind. It says, therefore, the church exhorts her sons that through a dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, carried out with prudence and love in witness to the Christian faith and life, they recognize, preserve, and promote good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these things. But notice this balanced approach. Not only do we highlight some of these good things found in these false religions, but we also call them to Jesus. It's a both and. Yeah, we can talk about the truth found in some of these false religions, sure. And we can say that that comes from God, sure. But we also need to be calling them to the one true faith. That's a balanced approach that Vatican II takes. And I also want to say it's interesting because that is the approach St. Paul takes in Acts chapter 17. Let's briefly read it for those who are not familiar. This is St. Paul going to Greeks, going to pagans. Watch what he does. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks. These are believers in the God of Israel, but they were Gentiles, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happen to be there. So he's out evangelizing people on the streets. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting place of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? So they want to hear more about this gospel. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. All the Athenian and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking and listening to the latest ideas. Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Now, that's a pretty wild claim. Wait, so Paul is saying, you worship this unknown God, and you're ignorant of what you worship. I'm now going to tell you who that one unknown God is. So he's saying, you got all these other false gods, but you also got this other unknown God, and that's the God I'm preaching to you today. So he's in a way saying these pagans who worship idols also worship the one true God. That's St. Paul. If you look, that's in the Bible. It's St. Paul. You might not like it. It is what it is. That's what he's saying. So obviously he's saying, look, you guys have some falsehood in your religion. You got some truth in your religion. There's some things in your religion that are not oriented towards the worship of the one true God. And there are some things in your religion that are oriented towards the one true God. He's saying this to pagans. So let me tell you about this unknown God that you worship in ignorance. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live, move, and have our being. Here he's quoting from pagan philosophers, and he's taking some of their quotes and he's saying these are true statements. So in other words, sometimes the pagans get it right. Sometimes these philosophers get it right. And he's showing them, here's where you actually got it right. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. So he's saying, look, you guys have some truth here. Your own poets have said this. We're his offspring. Here's where you get it right, and here's where you get it wrong. He's doing both. He's saying, here's the true in your religion, here's the falsehood in your religion. In the time past, so in the past, God overlooked such ignorance. So these errors that you had, God overlooked them in the past. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, to turn away from your falsehood, turn away from your idols, turn away from the errors that are in your religion, and embrace the truth. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed as Jesus. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. He says, look, Jesus rose from the dead. That's proof that there will be a resurrection. Now, when they heard this about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear more on this subject. Why? Because some of the philosophers, they just thought this is ridiculous. The body is a bad thing. Why would there be a resurrection of the body? This is just stupid. And they dismissed Paul. Others were like, no, that's interesting. I want to hear more. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Okay, so some listened, some didn't. But notice what he's doing there. That's a little different than you might think. He's saying, you pagans, you worship these false idols, and that's wrong, but then you worship the one true God through this unknown God that you have, this altar to, and that's the God I'm proclaiming to you. Let me tell you about him. Here's where you get it right. Here's where you get it wrong. So he's both saying simultaneously that they have a false religion and yet some truth in it, that they don't worship the one true God in some ways, and yet they worship the one true God in other ways. That's Paul, whether you like it or not. Now imagine if I just ripped Paul out of context and I just showed that part where Paul says, hey, you worship the one true God through this unknown God and this unknown altar, and that's it. I just left it at that. It would look like Paul's a universalist or a relativist, right? It would kind of look that way until you get the more balanced approach where, yeah, he's saying that, but then he's also saying they got some errors and they need to be purified of those errors, and he calls them to the one true faith. So then you get a more balanced perspective. Might that be what needs to take place here with Pope Francis? I'm seeing a lot of people pointing to what he's saying here, but then kind of ignoring what he said elsewhere that I just showed you, where he says Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by him. Where he says we got to evangelize everybody. That needs to be first and foremost. I'm kind of seeing people ignoring that, not trying to interact with that, not trying to give a full comprehensive view of what's taking place. They're just jumping the gun, automatically saying heresy, false religion, you're not a Christian, you're not with Christ, this is why Catholicism is wrong. I've seen people do that, but they're being lazy because they're not accounting for everything that's being said here. So I want to take a look one more time at what Pope Francis has said, and then reread it in light of what I just showed to you. And then I want to offer some criticisms of what Pope Francis has said. Okay, so we'll take a look at the two translations that we have available to us, one from the Vatican and one directly from that video. One of the things that struck me about you here is the ability to engage in interreligious dialogue. This is very important. If we start to fight among ourselves, saying my religion is more important than yours, my religion is true, yours is not, where will that lead? Okay, well, yeah, I certainly agree that in some cases it might not always be the best approach to immediately start out with I'm right, you're wrong kind of approach. Obviously, that might not always be the most effective thing. Sometimes it's effective to focus on what we have as far as what is common ground, and then we can get into what our differences are. So yeah, there is something to be said about the approach of not immediately starting out with I'm right, you're wrong, here's where you got it wrong, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I get that. But then he goes on to say, where will it lead? And one person said disaster. Someone respond to this, where will it lead? Yes, it's okay to discuss. And then they answer, because every religion is a way to arrive at God. And now let me say, okay, if what you mean by that, if what Pope Francis means by that is every religion has some truth in it, and that truth in it is a way to arrive at God. Okay, that is biblical, and that is what the magisterium is saying. But we need to make that more clear, because that isn't being explicitly said here. And what a lot of people are going to do is take away from this to say the whole religion itself, the false religion itself, is a way to God. And no, that's not true. And that would even contradict what Francis has said elsewhere. So he's kind of undermining his own statements when he does this. I also have to say, it's interesting in that video where he does this, he explicitly says, "Hey, I'm going off the cuff here. I'm deviating from my message here." So he's just speaking off the cuff. He explicitly says that. Every time he does that, it ends up being a disaster. It's kind of like, you know what, Pope Francis, actually, you need to stick to that script. Don't go off the cuff. Every time you do that, you get in trouble. And so here we are. Every religion is a way to arrive at God. That's only true if we're speaking about the good and the truth found in those religions. That's not true if we're speaking about the religion as a whole, because as the religion as a whole has a mixture of truth and errors in it. Another point that we're forgetting and is often not emphasized in these discussions is, yes, there is some truth in these false religions. Yes. You know what else there is in these false religions? Error. We're forgetting that part. Now, if we say the truth can help prepare them and lead them to the fullness of the faith in Christianity, guess what? The errors in those religions work in the opposite direction and serve as an obstacle for accepting the truth in the one true faith, and can help bring a person further away, further removed from God. So yes, there are some truths in these religions, and considered in some kind of isolated way that can help prepare them, sure. But we got to remember, but these aren't isolated teachings. These aren't isolated truths. They're mixed with and corrupted with errors that are actively working as obstacles and preventing people from the truth. So if we're going to emphasize the goodness found in these false religions to the exclusion of these other obstacles, well, we're overemphasizing something at that point. We need to be balanced. We need to take that balanced approach. Paul takes that balanced approach. Vatican II takes that balanced approach. Yeah, you can highlight some of those good and true things, and yeah, that helps prepare them, but still call them away from their errors and call them to the one true faith. You don't want to go to either extreme. You don't want to go to the extreme that says, hey, you know what, these false religions, they got nothing good and true in them. Well, that's not the case. That's a problem. But you also don't want to go to the other extreme where all you do is talk about the good found in these false religions to the exclusion of the bad that are serving as obstacles and preventing them from embracing the one true God. We need to be balanced here. And if we're taking an approach for the sake of dialogue that ends up being an approach that is not the one the Apostle Paul used in Acts 17, I want to say something went wrong. Something went wrong somewhere. That approach, something doesn't seem right about that. If our approach is at odds with the apostolic witness, something went wrong. Now, I understand there's different contexts in, the first century than compared to today. I get that. All right. Maybe in the first century, we're not going to eat meat with blood in it. I get that. Acts 15, sure. By the time of the Council of Florence, it's saying, yeah, you can eat meat with blood in it. All right. Different cultural context. But this isn't just something that is due to a difference in culture. This pertains to the proclamation of the gospel itself. And I think our approach needs to be consistent with how the apostles proclaim the gospel. All right, but let's continue with what Pope Francis is saying here. Zoom in a little bit more on that so you can see it a little bit better. All right, so he says, every religion is a way to arrive at God, sort of a comparison, so an analogy, would be that there are sort of like different languages in order to arrive at God. Okay, if you're speaking about the truth in them, maybe, sure. God can use implicit faith. God can infuse a person with grace in extraordinary cases, extra sacramentally. But how common is that? Would be one question. How certain is that? Would be another. And yeah, there's some truth in them, but there's also error when we need to call out that error. But okay, maybe he's talking about the truths in these different religions as different languages to arrive at God. But God is God for all. And if God is God for all, then we're all sons and daughters of God. Well, there's a sense in which that's true and a sense in which it's not. In the Bible, we're all sons and daughters of God in a general sense, in which we're all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. We're all sons of God in a general sense in creation, but we're not all sons and daughters of God in Christ. Only those who are in Christ Jesus are sons and daughters of God. So supernaturally speaking, not all of us are sons and daughters of God. Generally speaking, in creation, naturally, we're all sons and daughters of God. So there's a truth in which that could be said. There's also a sense in which that might not be true. Depends on what he's talking about. He doesn't specify, of course. We're all sons and daughters of God, but my God is more important than your God, some people are going to say. Is that true? Well, he says there's only one God. Well, hold on. Some of these religions don't believe that. Like the Hindu religions, they don't believe there's only one God. So obviously, whenever Pope Francis says there's only one God, and the Hindu comes along and says, no, actually, there's millions of them. Well, we're gonna have to have a discussion on that, right? We're gonna have to talk about the error that they have, where they believe there's more than one God. And now I know there's a lot of different Hinduisms out there and a lot of different perspectives on whether God is one or many in Hinduism. I understand that. I get that. But I think you get what I'm saying here. There's certainly some error there. He says there's only one God in each of us. And he says, and each of us is a language. Now that's different than what others are reporting who are saying, let's see, there's only one God, and religions are like language that try to express ways to approach God. Wait, is it the religion that's the language, or is it us that is the language? In the direct literal translation of what he was saying we are the language. Like we, not the religion, we. Okay, I understand that. My personal experience and path, meeting God. Yeah, sure. I can understand that. Can be spoken of metaphorically as a language to God, sure. But that is a little different than how the Vatican English translation is translating it. Certainly different than how it's being reported online, which this one that's being reported online everywhere doesn't seem to be rooted in what he actually said. Where it says there's only one God and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Okay, so and each of us is a language, so to speak, in order to arrive at God. There are different paths. Okay, if you mean there are different paths as far as each of us has our own path to God, like I have my own personal story, you got your own story. Yeah, sure. But there's only one true God, and we're only saved through Christ Jesus. So in that sense, there aren't many paths. And he's going to have to affirm that. And then he does affirm that elsewhere. So this is where he could be more clear. What do you mean by these different paths? And then he says, some Sikh, some Muslim, some Hindu, some Christian. Okay, but in that case, it's not the religion that is the path. It's rather the people who are experiencing God in their own path. So which one are you talking about? Are you saying their religion is a different path to God? Are you saying they have their own path as far as a personal experience? He's not entirely clear. But if he's just talking about my own personal experience, each of us has our own personal experience of meeting God. Okay, yeah, sure, that can certainly make sense. But if we're talking about the religion itself, we got to be more qualified at that point. Because if we're talking about false religions, yeah, the truth in them may be a path to God, sure. But the error in them is a path away from God. So we got to keep that in mind. And we also got to balance it out. Any salvation that anyone ever experiences is through Christ alone. And it is in an implicit faith in Christ, not in a false religion, that they will be redeemed. So you're not redeemed by believing in error. This is where he could be more nuanced, more clear. And this is where he needs to kind of explain himself better. He didn't do well by going off the cuff like this. I didn't think it was helpful. I just think it unnecessarily confuses people. I can kind of see what he's saying, but there's still some problems, still some difficulties to it. Not only the lack of clarity, the ambiguity, the on the surface inconsistency with what he said elsewhere, but also it really just seems to be an approach that doesn't jive very well with the approach that the apostles took in the book of Acts. I think that they were a little bit more balanced. Instead of just highlighting the good and talking about that, they did both things. They highlighted the good and then highlighted the bad, called people away from the error, and then called them to the one true faith. If what Pope Francis did is he said, hey, these false religions, they got some truth in them. And I want you to embrace those truths. And then I want you to get away from the errors in your religion. And I want to invite you all to all become Christian. If he had done that, I would say that seems a lot more balanced. That seems a lot more consistent with what takes place in the book of Acts. This other method of not really challenging people, not talking about the errors, I don't know if that's really as balanced as it should be. I don't know if that's really helpful to people. It's certainly a strategy that the popes in the post-conciliar church have adopted. It's not just Pope Francis. This is not just Pope Francis. John Paul II said stuff like this. Benedict did it too. So if Strickland and others are going to say, oh, Pope Francis, you're a heretic, you got to say that about JP2 and Benedict. Now, maybe they're willing to say that. Maybe they're going to go the Sedevacantists route and say, none of these popes, none of them are Christians, and they're none of them are even popes at all. Well, if you take that route, you might be more consistent, but you can't accuse Francis of heresy here and not do the same with John Paul II and Benedict. Maybe they haven't figured that out yet. Maybe they're not aware that Benedict and John Paul II have said the same thing. Maybe whenever they figure that out, they'll start asking deeper questions. But I want to challenge people to ask those deeper questions and say, this isn't just an issue or a concern with Pope Francis. This is the entire post-apostolic era. Now, I don't know if this approach is absolutely consistent with Vatican II. I don't think it is. As we saw, Vatican II takes the approach that St. Paul takes, as we saw there in Acts 17, where it highlights the good, but it also tells people that they have errors and calls them away from the errors and then calls them to the one true faith. Vatican II does the exact same thing. But in this ecumenical dialogue era in the post-conciliar church, I don't see people doing exactly that. I don't see them doing what Paul did or even what Vatican II is calling for. So insofar as we're not doing that, I want to say this approach seems to be a little unbalanced. It needs to be corrected. Now, why did this happen? Why do you have this kind of approach where we only talk about what's true in these false religions? We don't really challenge people. Honestly, I think it's an overreaction. It's an overreaction to an error when they did the exact opposite, where they only focused on the falsehood and didn't highlight the good or the true and the beautiful. It's kind of the pendulum swinging the other way. I also think it's because of just hundreds of years of war over religion, over differences. I think at some point, especially Pope Francis's generation, having gone through, they saw World War I, not him personally, but you get what I mean. They're coming out of that period. They saw World War I, World War II. They saw all this disaster. They saw the tension there with the Cuban Missile Crisis taking place at the time of the Second Vatican Council. They're seeing all of that, and they're just kind of like, okay, we need to just stop fighting. And so I think what they did is they course corrected, but overcorrected in some ways, to where all they want to do is talk about, the good and true and beautiful in these different religions. They don't really want to talk on things that are challenging. and they don't want to challenge each other or directly call people in some cases to the faith when they should. I think that's kind of what's going on here, and I'm not so sure that this approach has been entirely successful or balanced, but I do think that that's partly why it's going on. So maybe it's time for us to correct this balance, especially because I want to say, the world that I'm living in is not the world Pope Francis is living in. It's just not the same world. Pope Francis is in a position where he can have dialogue with these world leaders, and they're just focusing on the good, and they're just focusing on things that they have in common. All right, that might work for Pope Francis, but I live over here, in the common world, where most of the interaction I'm getting with non-Christians is critical of Christianity, people attempting to tear down Christianity, people attacking the faith. In that environment where missiles are constantly coming at you, this notion of just focusing on what we share in common with these other people, that just doesn't work in a time of war. And I feel like I'm living in a time of war. I don't know. Pope Francis is living in a very different environment where it's a time of peace. I'm over here with most of the people in the common world where we're dealing with a time of war. And focusing on what is true, good, and beautiful in these religions doesn't really do anything in a time of war. So though there might be something to be said about that approach, I'm not so sure if it's working right now for the most part. Now, be that as it may, I'll have people on this show who are of other religions, and yes, sometimes we will focus on things we have in common. Absolutely. Sometimes. At other times, we'll have material that directly challenges each other. And at other times, I'm very clear, hey, come to the Christian faith. So I'm trying to take that balanced approach. And I'm not saying that in every situation, you got to just focus on what differences we have and call people in every situation explicitly to the gospel. I understand there might be strategically some cases where we do want to focus on what we have in common. I get that. I get that. But we can't just do that. And I kind of feel like Pope Francis and some of these popes have lived in that world where they can afford to just do that. But that's not most of us out here in the common world. We're not living in that world. So I'm just not so sure how helpful and successful this approach is that Pope Francis and many of these popes in the post-conciliar era have engaged in. So I think there are still some difficulties at the end of the day, even when you get beyond the translation issues, even when you consider the full spectrum of Catholic theology here. I think there's some still difficulties and challenges. Not so much to the doctrine, but the method, the approach. I don't have any criticisms of the doctrine when we properly understand what is being said, but I do think that there are some concerns with the approach. So I do want to try to take that balanced perspective and offer that as some guidance to people. I hope that was helpful. If it was, let me know. Put that in the comment section. Hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button. I'd love to hear from you. Some people are not going to agree. That's okay. Just be respectful. Put it in the comment section. Love to hear from you. I don't have an issue. I don't have a problem at all with people disagreeing as long as you're respectful. Don't lie. Don't slander. And I don't have a problem. But if you agree, I also want to hear from you. Tell me why you agree. If you have some agreements but some criticisms, love to hear from you as well. Just put them in the comment section. But again, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. If you're just now tuning in, there's a lot of people who have already downvoted this video before I even went live, before I even started it. Already, people are disliking it. It's like I haven't even said a word yet. So go ahead and help offset the trolls. Do that for me. And I hope this was helpful to you all. Hey, consider supporting me at patreon.com/reason and theology. I would greatly appreciate it. That way I could continue to do material like this. So if you found this beneficial, if you have been benefiting from this channel for a while, I ask that you go ahead and do that. Not just hit the subscribe button, but consider supporting me monthly in what I'm doing here with Reason and Theology, either at Patreon or Locals. I'm on Locals. You get access to extra content with either one of those platforms that are there for patrons only, or just become a channel member right here on YouTube at any level of participation. You'll be supporting the channel. And like I say, you get access to plenty of extra patron-only content. So, all right, y'all, that's going to do it. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless.